Okay, so now let's start looking at what really makes up metadata and what are the conceptual components of metadata and how do they interact. And this is sort of a two-slide process. On this slide, you've got the text that sort of lists what the components are and tells you a little bit about what that means. And then on the next slide is a diagram of how they interact. Let's go through the definitions now for starters, and then when you see the diagram of how they interrelate, then we can look at some examples and you'll do some activities that will help solidify the concepts. Come back to this slide periodically to remind yourselves of what the components are and what their functions are. The text on this slide should be pretty handy for you to keep at hand. So first off, we have the information resources themselves. Those are sort of the focal player when we're talking about the process of creating metadata. You don't have metadata until you have whatever the initial data is or the information resources. So we define that as the fundamental unit to be described. So whether you're describing books, photos, web pages, articles, videos, series, collections, whatever. So that's what the information resource refers to. Metadata elements are the individual attributes of resources to be described. Author, title, URL, number of pages, rating, other metadata elements might be, price, subject, so on and so forth. So those are metadata elements. They're just characteristics of an information resource. Content standards are rules for creating properly formatted metadata elements. The AACR2, which is actually being phased out over, it's going to take years and years for it to be completely phased out, but in sort of the library world, there's a new content standard document that's come out called RDA, which is meant to be what would normally be AACR3 is basically RDA. It's like an update. It's from the same people, the people at the Library of Congress. But the idea of both of these, AACR2 and RDA, is to give standardized rules that can apply across hundreds or thousands of different settings, library settings, or other information organizations, that gives standardized, consistent ways for information elements to be formatted. How do authors' names get formatted, for example? Is it last name, comma, space, first name? What about a middle initial? What about a junior or senior or a doctor or reverend that goes in front of a name? Content standards would tell you exactly what to do so that there is consistency within the same organization and also from one organization to another, and how those metadata elements get populated with data. So next is metadata schema, which I mentioned earlier. A metadata schema is the conceptual plan for creating metadata records. It includes a set of elements. So one metadata schema that you'll hear a good bit about in this course and probably throughout your training in the iSchool and into your careers is the Dublin Core. MODS is another one, and encoded archival description is yet another one. There are thousands of metadata schemas, more than you can shake a stick at, and we'll talk about that a little bit later on in the presentation too, about why there are so many metadata schemas. But a schema can be thought of as sort of a template for creating metadata records. A schema tells you what fields or what elements are available for describing the individual characteristics of an information resource. And the schema assembles those metadata elements usually in a certain order, and it would be at the metadata schema level where the content standards are selected and applied. So for instance, two organizations might use the same set of elements in their metadata schemas, but then each organization might use slightly different content standards for populating those elements according to the needs of the organization. So the metadata schema is sort of the master plan. Finally, the last thing we have in our list of conceptual components is the metadata record. Sometimes I refer to this as a surrogate record. It's an individual instantiation of a metadata schema. And what I mean by that is if you take a metadata schema and you treat it as a template, And then you take an information resource in your hand, say you pick up your textbook, and you fill out that template with the particulars, then you have a metadata record for your textbook. That's what I mean by it being an instantiation of a metadata schema. The description of a particular resource using the rules and attributes specified in the schema and the content standards. So the components of metadata. And in the next slide, you'll see a diagram of how they interrelate. So here's our diagram that lays out how the individual components of metadata interrelate together. So starting from the upper left-hand corner, we have a metadata schema, which is constructed from individual metadata elements, which are written and formatted according to content standards. And then the metadata schema is used to guide the proper and consistent creation of metadata records. The image on the slide there, I think, is of a MARC record. And the metadata record represents an information resource. So those are sort of all the pieces of the bear. Now, notice that the top and bottom regions of the diagram are two separate stories. They're sort of two separate chains of influence. They are connected only because they are both attached to the metadata schema. The top region has to do with the creation of metadata schemas by assembling metadata elements. This all happens at the general level. That is, these things are done without regard to any one specific information resource. Certainly, elements are defined and schemas are created in light of some understanding of the character. I mean, the information professionals have to sort of know what's in the collection before they know which metadata elements should be assembled into the metadata schema. The people in the organization might evaluate their information resources and their users to identify which characteristics belong in this particular metadata schema. But once you create a metadata schema, that same schema is used to describe all information resources in the collection from now on. If a particular element doesn't apply to a particular resource, then that particular metadata record can exclude whatever the absent element is. But the metadata schema should identify each and every characteristic that would be worth describing in this collection. Now, this is different than saying that the schema should identify each and every characteristic that might occur within the collection. You don't have to describe every conceivable aspect of all the information resources. Instead, you should create metadata schemas with the intention of capturing and describing those characteristics of information resources that will help users to search and recognize information resources that will meet their needs. This requires some understanding of the information needs of the target users, and it requires understanding of the characteristics of the resources that will constitute the collection, now and in the foreseeable future. So, looking at the bottom of the diagram, the metadata schema is being applied. It is being used to create metadata records, which represent, via description, information resources. So now it's time for you to head over to the message boards. Frankly, you can do this either now or later. It's not integral to understanding the rest of the lecture that you do it now and then come back. But this would be conceptually where activity 1 would fall. If you go over to the message boards and you look for the discussion forum labeled session 5, within session 5 there's activity 1, explore metadata elements. What you'll be doing in this activity is just you can choose to do one or both, and you're just going to go into one of the major metadata schemas that's in use today. One of these is EAD, Encoded Archival Description, for creating finding aids for archives. And then the other one is MARC, which is a huge player in the library world. And MARC is a format for creating machine-readable records that can be exchanged among libraries. So you can go and you can look at those metadata schemas, and I just want you to poke around with the elements to see what kinds of elements are included. Are there too much? Are there too many? And then to dig down into the details of a few elements. And so do that and then respond on the message boards. Sorry about the phone ringing. So Taylor and Jowdry, your textbook authors, identify three types of metadata elements. The types are descriptive. These are what we typically think about when we think about metadata, things like author, title, subject. Structural metadata elements tell information professionals, computer systems, or end users how to properly assemble, display, and navigate the information resource. The third type is administrative metadata. Administrative metadata elements are usually not intended for end users, although they can be. Rather, they are information for people who manage and maintain information resources on how to properly manage and maintain that particular resource. So these are pretty broad functions, and the line that divides one function from the next might not always be exactly clear. But it is useful as we look at metadata elements to think about the underlying purpose that element serves. And these groupings, descriptive, structural, and administrative, give us one way of categorizing elements so that we can better understand their similarities and differences, whether we're looking at elements within one schema or maybe we're comparing elements from two different schemas. If you're looking at a metadata schema, you can orient yourself by saying, what are the administrative elements in this schema? What are the descriptive elements? So it sort of gives you a way to kind of frame your analysis. Then you can read the schema's documentation to find out what the rules and conventions are for using that particular element. I'll say a few words here about structural as an element category. That's the middle one. I don't think Taylor and Jowdry are entirely clear about what is and is not structural metadata. I mean, they might be entirely clear as in they probably understand it, but I don't think they wrote it very well to make it clear what it really is, or maybe I just disagree with them. But their discussion seems to lean pretty heavily toward using structural metadata only to describe technical aspects of assembling complex digital resources. But I think that structural metadata can be thought of more broadly. If a resource is a volume in a series, for example, then structural metadata could say which volume this is out of how many volumes. Another example is some periodicals are published as loose leaf pages, and updates are sent to subscribers as replacement pages. I think that structural metadata would explain to the subscriber, which is usually a library, which pages in the loose leaf binder to remove and replace with each update. As Taylor and Jowdry say, structural metadata can also pertain to digital objects, of course, and their proper assembly and display, including things like aspect ratios and frame rates, for example, for video. But those are the different types of metadata elements, and I think they really can be a useful way for sort of thinking about the different things that metadata elements might do, if not being especially useful as an absolute classification.